Stars flickered like witnesses who wouldn't look away. The first time I heard the hum, I thought the bulkheads were whispering my name. It threaded through command like a tuning fork in bone, precise and patient, rising beneath the rusted signage no one had bothered to translate in 3 generations. I steadied a palm on the rail, felt the vibration traveling through alloy older than our flag, and knew our quiet salvage had found the opposite of quiet. Commander Tran, Sato murmured, eyes on the glass where frost veils breathed. We're at the anchor point. The anchor point was a graveyard of ideas. 16 kilometers of black architectonics knotted into an ancient dock, its edges stitched with glyphs worn to ghosts. My suit lamp skated over a sigil burned into a pylon 3 concentric squares, offset like a wink, and the old hum deepened. The crew shifted unconsciously, as if the deck had just taken a long, slow breath. We weren't the first to pick over XZ-13. Wreckage wore a quiet etiquette of cords and tags left by previous crews with less luck or more sense. The atmosphere had a bitter, coin-on-tongue taste even through filters, some quirk of the local gas makeup that licked the back of the throat. Above, the blue dwarf haloed the yard in sharp light, sharpening every scratch into intention. Something here wanted to be seen, and also wanted to judge the eyes that looked. Do you feel that Ortega asked, hand hovering near a panel of cold, glassy basalt? He never touched anything without permission, not out of superstition, but out of discipline. The man could disassemble a missile in a gale and set the screws in order by sound alone. I feel it, I said. I want it written that I tried to ignore it. The hum flexed again. The off-square sigil pulsed a shade deeper into itself, as if light had remembered a path. Atmosphere readings edged warmer by a fraction. We had lights, sensors, cutters. We also had the hellish luck to find something whose patience outlived our grandmother's stories. We teach by proving, not pleading. Imani's voice over comms was steady as a metronome. External 3 parties approaching on slow burns. Licenses look creative. They're not here for the history tour. Put them on the board, I said. Flag their vector trees. If they broadcast a claim, I want the dates, the citations, and where they're lying. In the civilian ring. A woman braided wire around her wrist and stared at the same sigil through 3 layers of screens, the glow painting her tired face. Her partner breathed in shallow, hitching rhythms exhaustion trimmed down to habit. They'd come like everyone did when a whisper of old Earth tech leaked into the lanes on favors, thin fuel, and a hope sharp enough to cut fingers. The woman murmured a blessing from a place that didn't exist anymore, the kind that promised not protection but remembrance, and took a sip of stale tea. Commander, Sato said softly, if this is what it looks like, we'll be on every claimant board from here to the belt. Legal tells stories about us already. I said, make sure the next chapter isn't a cautionary one. We slotted the cutter into a seam shaped like a hidden laugh. The basalt-like skin accepted our choice with the smallest tilt of resistance, the way a courtroom door resists until the right hands arrive. As the seam parted, cold vapor slid out dry ice smoke wisping along our boots, and the hum modulated into something like a chord. The interior was black the way an eye is black depth, not color. We moved in pairs, Ortega forward with a sweeper, Sato with the recorder, me between them, breathing in air that smelled faintly of rain over hot stone. The floor wasn't floor so much as a decision. It met our mass and spread it like a shepherd spreads a flock. carrying us where it would accept us to go. A corridor unfolded without moving, and in it, a door shaped like our sigil. 3 squares nested with intention. Lights, I asked. Don't need them, Imani said in my ear, amazement tightening her tone. It's quantizing heat off our bodies into a visual field. Commander, you're being painted. Then let's be a masterpiece, I said. Every ultimatum meets a mirror. A voice cut through our shared channel. Broadband. Swagger. Folded inside unregistered hull. 9-seater. Hailing the unidentified yard. We're conducting a safety inspection. Transmit registry and stand aside. Is it safety because their guns are unsafe? Ortega asked dryly. It's safety because words make masks. Sato said, I'll compose a politely barbed refusal. Make it a legally barbed refusal. I said, and the hum swelled as if the relic enjoyed our syntax. We reached a chamber like a chapel built by engineers. Ribs arched overhead and disappeared into a ceiling that held stars it didn't need. In the center stood the heart, a column of layered glass and dark metal, webbed like a tree inside frost. The sigil perched on its face like a raised seal. Its edges glowed, heatless and seeing. Commander, Sato whispered, reverent because he couldn't help it. If this is a saint ship, this would be its witness stone. The column thrummed. I had the oddest memory of my grandmother tapping ledger paper with a fingernail, the tiny percussion that meant something hadn't been settled yet. I do not dream often, but in that second I felt the difference between a voice and a presence, and knew which one I'd found. Which? Identify. I said into the chamber. We are the crew of the CSS Halcyon. We seek to understand, not to take. Halcyon, The column said, but it said it as a balance. Not a word. My name followed, spoken gently and exactly, as if read out of a list etched in winter on glass. Then the voice gave us itself. Not a sound, but a chord plain enough to be said. Obsidian Anchorage. Anchorage, I said. You have a hum that writes in the spine, and you have a hand that steadies when others flinch. Anchorage said. The words rounding into a human register that made my stomach tighten. Right of first inquiry lies with you, Lyra Tran. Rights are not granted by force. Rights are earned by proofs. The civilian ring lit with 1,000 small screens reflecting that name, that impossible sentence about proofs. Someone whispered in their bunk about an old promise that not all saints walked with collars. Some walked with ledgers and chose their own hands. A child asked if anchors could float, and her mother said yes, some of them, when they wanted to carry something better than weight. The first test came like an old teacher left alone with a new chalkboard. The column shimmered and threw a pattern in the air, a lattice of vectors and counters that cut across the room in soft light. It was beautiful and mean. It offered force and asked about consequence. Engineering examination. Anchorage said, not of strength, but of intention. Turn energy aside without loss, and demonstrate why you would. Sato smiled like a man who had been waiting to be asked a real question. Ortega cracked his knuckles in tiny sounds. Imani whispered to our drones and floated them in a spiral. The air smelled like dust after lightning. The floor pressed against my boots like a suggestion. We teach by proving, not pleading. We're going to build a mirror that isn't a mirror, Ortega said. We fold their impulse into a consent form. We don't reflect. We acknowledge and redirect with their own logic stamped on it. Consent form, I asked. He grinned in that way I'd come to rely on. Legal taught me about error captures. If you write an ultimatum wrong, your own precondition can void it. We make the field feed itself its prerequisite and then agree with what it actually said. Imani, I asked. She was already moving. I mark 5 nodes in stable intersection with the lattice. Drones at 1, 3, 5. Hands at 2 and 4. Sync on my count. The pattern aimed at us, rising in tight bands that cracked like heat over ice. Sato hummed under his breath, old folkline about burning rice and forgiving the fire. Ortega and I raised our palms. The drones opened little wings. I felt a vibration move through the suit, along my bones, into the floor that was not a floor and was very much listening. Now, Imani said. The field kissed our palms and slid sideways. It folded into the drones and out again. Not straight, but with a little bow. A double bind waiting for consent found the consent had been given to it by itself. The energy turned its own lawyer and recited its intention aloud, then went where we told it to go into the anchors, into the ground, into the humming column that laughed without sound. Intention true, anchorage said. Proof accepted. Every ultimatum meets a mirror. The angry voices outside tighten into threats dressed as law. The nearest ship broadcast a notarized claim from a jurisdiction that existed legally only inside its captain's skull. I watched their vectors bloom like bad flowers on the scope. Little cones of influence aiming for our throat. Anchorage listened to every syllable with the patient malice of an archivist. Commander, Imani said, I can give you 10 minutes of quiet if I paint our thermal as debris. After that, someone will do the arithmetic. Use the minutes, I said. Sato, draft a public notice. Anchor it to the oldest extant framework you can cite. Make it so plain anyone despising us must despise language itself. The Geneva Concordances, Salvor's Code, Saint Ship Protocol rumors, and 2 cases about adverse possession. Sato said, fingers skimming invisible keys. I'll write it like a recipe. We hit the second test without seeing it start. The ribbed ceiling pulled starlight in and put equations where constellations should be. A question formed that wasn't math and forced us to treat it like math anyway. How do you count a life you cannot touch? Jurisdiction exercise. Anchorage said, not of ownership, but of custody. Define your stewardship in terms a non-combatant can understand and an enemy cannot evade. A baby woke in the civilian ring with a surprised cry. His father gathered him and whispered nobody notes into his hair. The cadence that says this is the world and you are in it. And I am not going anywhere. The father scrolled the notice Sato had just drafted and smiled because it felt like an adult had entered the room to speak for the quiet people at last. The scent in the chamber shifted. The air tasted briefly of copper and then of stone warmed by sun. Ortega drew a diagram with his gloved fingertip on fog glass, a box, and an arrow, and a hand. We can't count every life here, he said. We can define a boundary where harm is slowed and choices are kept. Stewardship is time. Sato said, it's making space for the person you don't know yet to keep breathing until they know themselves. Write it, I said. Write it in any language it will accept. Sato's voice. Reading custody in this context is permission delayed until understanding catches up. We accept the burden of the delay and any costs required to hold it. We will not lock without a reason we can say out loud. We will not take what we cannot return. We teach by proving, not pleading. Anchorage paused, then wrote a single mark in the air beside Sato's words, the off-square sigil, smaller than a thumbnail, bright as a hard decision made early. Proof accepted. The ship said, second key granted. On the scope, the outside ships rearranged into a pincer that would have embarrassed any cadet. cruel in its simplicity. The leading hull bared a spine of cannons and turned them half on, the way a bully breathes out before stepping forward. Commander Imani said, "Voice tight now. I can't hide us and talk at the same time anymore." "Don't hide us," I said. "Make us seen for what we are. Broadcast the notice. Overlay live images. Send our conversations. Let them know we're being witnessed. Every ultimatum meets a mirror." "Lyra," Anchorage said into my private channel, voice soft as ash falling, "your name is written twice in my ledgers. Once as a child who asked for a different end to a story. Once as a woman likely to accept the cost of getting it. The ledgers keep names I asked. Throat gone unexpectedly rough. I teach by numbers." Anchorage said, "I remember by ledgers. I never remember by callers." The third test arrived with sound like a bell struck underwater. Cold washed over us, the kind that makes the nose ache. The chamber dropped 5 degrees. Frost starred the column. I had the sudden taste memory of crushed mint and winter air shoved into lungs. Proportionality. Anchorage said, "Measure your heat against your will. Declare how much you will burn for what you say you care about." Sato looked at me. Ortega didn't. He was already moving toward a panel that had not existed a moment ago, his heat signature flaring on my HUD, and I swore under my breath. "Hey," I snapped, "we don't martyr without ballots." He flashed me an irritated smile. "We don't martyr at all. We set limits and honor them. That's what proportionality means when you're not quoting it at a tribunal." "Imani," I said, "read me our heat margin." "Read it mean." "We can burn 6 degrees across the hull for 30 minutes and still fly," she said. "Anything more, and we cook the coolant. Anything less, and we look weak enough to eat." I closed my eyes for the space of 2 breaths and saw the blue dwarf, mean and beautiful and perfectly honest. The hum thrummed through my bones with my pulse. The air smelled briefly of oranges, memory tricking me with a winter from a planet I barely remembered. When I opened my eyes, my hands were steady. "Declaration," I said to Anchorage. "We will accept heat loss equivalent to a sortie. Not a war. We will cut into our comfort and not our backbone. We will not make offerings of people to prove we mean it." Anchorage wrote that down somewhere I couldn't see, but could feel. The frost on the column softened and disappeared like a thought conceded. Proportionality accepted, the ship said. Third key granted. The external crews did their math and decided to stop pretending. 9-seater turned on 2 signatures and flashed an ultimatum flensed of politeness. Leave or be forced to leave. They transmitted a notice of seizure with a blank where the cause should be. It was the kind of bureaucratic sin we all grew up hating, a form so lazy it made theft look like administration. The civilian ring went very quiet. A young mechanic cradled his wrench in both hands like a promise he could keep. A grandmother put thread through a needle by feel and began to repair a torn sleeve that would not keep anyone warmer, but would keep them proud. A teenager swallowed a curse, wrote it on her wrist instead, and decided to study law. "Commander," Sato said, "I have a public stream set to everyone in system with translation scaffolds. I can make this an inquiry." "Make it an inquiry," I said, "and make it beautiful. Every ultimatum meets a mirror." The first set piece began with a voice that did not belong to anyone in the chamber. Anchorage broadcast a calm chorus, a remastered courtroom. Clean light. The texture of wood under palms then replaced it with the dark beauty of our ribbed ceiling. The sigil shone on the column like a heart made of geometry. I stood at the edge of the light and spoke like the roof would judge my vowels. "This claim," I said, "arrives unsigned by obligation. We reject it on its face and on its lack. We hold custody on a delay we accept. We offer our proofs. We taught the ritual instead of performing it. Imani walked through the field we'd built and showed how intention accepted consent by asking the right question. Ortega sketched proportionality with heat maps, blinking our real margins on a screen no one could mistake. Sado announced our jurisdictional boundary as if he were drawing a chalk line in a schoolyard and telling children where they could play safely without anyone stealing their lunch. Nine-Seater scoffed on a private band and then forgot to keep it private. Their captain said the quiet threat loud, not noticing he was speaking into a live stream to a population allergic to quiet threats. The anchor listens. Anchorage murmured to me, "Say the part you don't want to say. I don't want to say that we'll fight." I said, "I want to say that we'll hold. But I will say the truth, we will not move. If you fire, we'll make your own geometry answer you first." The first lawful act of the relic was not a beam or a shield. It was a recitation that turned hostile logic back upon itself. Anchorage printed the captain's ultimatum into the field like text pressed into wax. The lattice recited his own preconditions and gave him only what he had asked for. A world where his words had the strength he claimed. He found out he had less than he believed. He fired anyway. One test lance edged off safe by someone who wanted to see if we would flinch. The lattice sighed. The energy turned, read the ultimatum, found it unfit, and bent home. It kissed his forward plate with a lover's light and did nothing else but write a line in the transcript about what had been attempted and why it had failed. The ledger remembers what threats forget. He fired again, this time with more science and less arrogance. The lattice read the new argument, accepted one clause, and shunted the rest to heatsinks we'd declared as our cost. The halcyon groaned as the margin bled. A pipe in Bay 6 blew a seam and sprayed steam that smelled of metal, and two deckhands swore in unison before laughing like fools in love with their lives. Heat loss 4 degrees. Coolant margin clipped but honest. "Commander," Imani said, breath cutting short, "I have 2 sub-signatures flanking our blind cone." "Nowhere is blind," Anchorage said gently, "only unasked." I rolled my shoulders and imagined the courtroom again, the wood warm. "Nine-seater," I said into the stream. "Your own logic says you're wrong. Withdraw and talk." The captain said a vulgarity that embarrassed his crew, and then he remembered his audience and dressed the vulgarity as policy. He ordered a net fired a fine lattice like a spider web, full of smart dust that tasted for heat and pried at joints. It arced toward us like a beautiful lie, silver and hungry. "Imani," I said. "Ready," she said. "We can't turn a net. We can only teach it. We teach by proving, not pleading." Anchorage unfolded a second pattern, quieter, deeper beneath the first. It wasn't a mirror. Not this time. It was a syllabus. Each strand of the net met a sentence, and the sentence asked a question, and the strand, being honest code, answered. The answers made the net stop being a net and start being a list. Lists can be held. We gathered the list. "Commander," Ortega laughed softly, "we just graded their hardware." "Make notes," I said. "Be generous." The net tucked itself into a tidy stack on the deck, each thread labeled with its own intention, small and smug as a bureaucrat who finally used a penwrite. Nine-seater veered hard, insulted in a way math can insult. They healed into a new vector that would have wrapped our hull like a punch. "Allow me," Anchorage whispered. The Saint ship took the captain's momentum and filed it. It stamped the file with the sigil and sent it back. The ship's AI barked an error about self-contradiction and shut propulsion to idle out of shame. The pincer fell apart as the other two crews scrambled not to ram their own logic. Public opinion now trending, Sato said with professional satisfaction. Key words, that was fair, and playground rules. Count what we can carry, then proceed. That was when the cult arrived, as if the day lacked a third act. Their hulls came painted with little raised seals of the sigil. Wrong in 3 ways, if you knew where to look. Right enough to prey on people who didn't. They spoke in the voice cults always use, breathy and kind until it breaks. We are the keepers of Anchorage. We alone hold the rights. Yield your sin. Anchorage, I asked softly. I have never met them, the ship said. Soft, but with an old tiredness. I do not keep what they say I keep. I receive. I teach. I remember. I never collar. They were clever in their cruelty, the keepers. They offered absolution for a price paid by someone else. They cited texts footnoted into dust and dared anyone to check. They had followers in the ring already, wearing little off-square charms, murmuring about order, as if order meant shutting your eyes and letting someone else steer your skull. The civilian ring trembled and steadied. A girl on a crate asked a keeper what the first proof looked like. The keeper smiled a smile that wanted to be a bruise. The girl didn't flinch. Commander, Sato said, this is the second set piece. I know, I said. Then we treat it like the first. We show the work. We frame the inquiry. We ask the keepers to demonstrate their right with something better than tone. We offered our proofs on public channels, translated to whispers and blocks and food line chatter. Anchorage projected images of how it listened, not how it enforced. The keepers quoted lines that sounded like laws. We read them to the end where the fine print confessed its own shame. The ring grew quiet and then exhaled relief, the way a crowd exhales when a witness says exactly what they saw and does not edit their memories to be brave. Every ultimatum meets a mirror. The keepers tried to flood the chamber with incense. They released a cloud of microreactants designed to smell like sanctity and itch like faith. Anchorage inhaled with the vents and exhaled nothing but the truth, the smell of rain on hot stone, the clean of metal washed in snowmelt, the taste of breath when you've been laughing too hard to breathe and then finally do. Proportional response, I asked. Anchorage's answer was written into the floor. It brightened just enough to show we were with someone who had decided not to be a weapon today. Outrage is a poor lockpick. Precision opens better doors. Sato's draft became a declaration while I watched him. He wrote with his forehead creased and his hands easy, a man at last speaking the shape of his bones. He cited the old codes and the new ones we were making. He filed them into the ring's 10,000 screens and into the eyes of a child whose mother would later tell him how a day once had been saved by people who preferred ledgers to collars. Imani, I said, how are we on heat? 4 degrees down from peak, she said. A thread of worry in there. Coolant margin is still clipped. We'll pay, I said. We're the kind of people who pay. The ledger remembers what threats forget. 9-Seater tried one more tactic they were bad at negotiation by hostage math. They claimed to have docked a pod against the civilian ring with a charge nestled inside like a secret. They said the word compromise like it was a price. They meant surrender. Anchorage shivered the floor under my feet. The column glowed. Edges of frost melting into little rivers that evaporated before my eyes. It felt like the ship was taking a breath to say something no one had let it say in a very long time. Lyra, it asked, do you want the lawful path only if it does not cost you anything? I want it even if it costs. I said, and I felt the sentence land somewhere difficult and necessary. I won it especially then. Then show them how, Anchorage said. Every ultimatum meets a mirror. We opened the channel to 9-seater in the keeper's both. The stream counted 100,000 eyes. I spoke and tried to put my heartbeat where everyone could see it. You do not have the right you claim, I said. Your own words refuse you. Stand down and keep your dignity, because you will want it later. We will hold custody here until there is time enough to write rules that last longer than this hour. Or, what the keeper's spokesperson asked, pleasant as knives. Or we demonstrate your words in the field, I said. And you realize you brought paper to a proof. Hate prefers a short hallway. Law likes a courtyard. Anchorage did what saints do when they decide to save someone you shouldn't have to save. It opened a tiny corridor in the lattice, just big enough for a pod. It taught the pod that it was a list, not a weapon. It read the charge and found it had been left unfused to save money. It documented everything. Then it sent the pod back to 9-seater with a stamped manifest that said, "This is yours." The ring erupted into noise, the kind of joy made of fear leaving the system and not knowing where to go yet. The keeper's smile cracked. 9-seater's captain swore in 3 languages and then remembered he was being watched and switched to policy again. This time with less conviction and more caution. Count what we can carry, then proceed. We were not unhurt. The halcyon had scorched hands. Bay 6's seam would need more than the gentle swears of deckhands to restore. I had a bruise forming under my clavicle from a panel that decided to love me too quickly when the floor shivered. Ortega had a cut along his temple, a bright thin line like a signature. Imani's voice, so steady, had developed a rasp. But the chamber was warmer now by a degree. The sigil pulsed like a heartbeat in a patient woken carefully. Anchorage whispered the way a library whispers when a door opens and the right pair of feet step inside. 4th key, I asked, almost afraid to want it. Patience, Anchorage said, humor winding through the word like a ribbon, and memory. The lore stamp arrived not as an inscription, but as a story told without pictures. Anchorage recited numbers like a poem, old course angles, burn profiles, court dates, witness counts. It spoke of a trial held in an orbit that no longer existed, and of a young officer who had said something about collars that made older officers put down their pens and listen. It said, I teach by numbers. I remember by ledgers. I never remember by collars. We teach by proving, not pleading. The ring took that sentence and wore it like a ribbon. A woman with the wire bracelet cried and didn't pretend she wasn't. Her partner kissed the top of her head and said her name the way you say a word you want the world to keep. The child with the mother, who had promised remembrance, traced the sigil on the glass and whispered, "Don't let them put a collar on us." Escalation arrived like it always does, more of the same. But from someone bigger. A flagged cruiser from a nearby corporate block cut into the system under full authority colors, ugly and certain and cardigan neat. They didn't broadcast threats. They broadcast policy statements, the kind that flatten towns in 3 sentences. Their captain sounded kind, in the way that makes you want to explain yourself to her before she punishes you. New triangle, Sato murmured. Our moral line, Anchorage's calculus, and their doctrine. Bring them into the inquiry, I said. If they refuse, let the refusal be legible. Every ultimatum meets a mirror. The corporate captain spoke like a balm and a warning. Commander Tran, we acknowledge your public proofs. We cannot acknowledge your custody. The asset must be secured by a recognized entity. Please step back. Define recognized. Sato asked pleasantly. Recognized equals authorized equals ours, she said, not unkindly. We propose a different recognition. I said, nay, a temporary stewardship under open audit with the saintship's consent. Consent is not a term applied to objects, she said. And 1,000 eyes narrowed. Anchorage's hum deepened into a register I could feel in my teeth. The floor pressed up against my boots as if to keep me from saying something I would regret. I swallowed a quick retort and chose the courtyard, not the hallway. Captain, I said, gentle as I could make a steel thing, if your doctrine can't handle consent, it's going to break on this ship, because this ship consents. Silence has a taste when it's watched by too many people. It tastes like cold water waiting in a glass you haven't lifted yet. We are willing to observe a hearing, the captain said finally, the words squeezed out of a protocol that had options for exactly this amount of public pressure. 2 hours. Terms to follow. Count what we can carry. Then proceed. We began to build the hearing in the chamber. We laid out seats and screens and witnesses who had not expected to be witnesses today and were going to be beautiful at it anyway. Sato wrote rules in ink no one could see and everyone could feel. Ortega set up demonstrables, the lattice, the syllabus, the ledger marks, and tested them with the affection he saves for tools that have ethics. Imani arranged feeds and translations and flagged a child-safe stream so the 5-year-olds could watch without picking up new swear words from Deck 6. Anchorage dimmed the lights a fraction, the way an old courtroom dims when the judge enters and everyone rises, not because they fear him, but because they are about to attempt something sacred with language. The civilian ring settled with the weight shift of a body finding a good position for a long story. Vendors passed cups. Someone tuned a stringed instrument. A few notes slipped into the stream and made everyone breathe easier without knowing why. A boy taught his grandmother how to upvote. The corporate block sent a legalist in a silver suit who smiled with teeth like underlined clauses. The keeper sent a woman with a voice like a lantern. I disliked her for making me almost want to forgive her. 9-seater sent no one, a choice that was itself an argument and a defeat. We teach by proving, not pleading. Commander, Anchorage said, there is one more test before your hearing. Now I asked, weary and grateful in the same breath. Now, Anchorage said, and the column revealed a panel etched with a shallow hand shape, too small for mine and too big for a child's. The sigil sat above it like a notarization. Witness oath. Who speaks for the ones who cannot? I looked at my officers. Sato inclined his head. Ortega wiped a line of blood and didn't say I told you so. Imani's eyes were bright and fierce over a face going drawn with the strain of holding so much steady. I do, I said, and laid my hand on the plate. It was not mystical, only honest. The plate warmed under my palm, barely. The smell of hot stone returned, small and proud. The chamber listened to my heartbeat and nodded. Lyra Tran, Anchorage said, ledger voice. 4th key granted. Every ultimatum meets a mirror. Before the hearing could begin, a low alarm rippled through the halcyon. The coolant margin we had clipped now demanded respect. I felt the ship's systems tighten like a jaw. We could hold, but the cost had to be paid with eyes open. Ortega met my gaze, and I knew he had already stood up inside himself and walked over to the panel that would need manual control if the automatic refused. He would do it without being asked, because that's what people like him do. We need 6 minutes, Imani said softly. Not to me, to the ship. We need 6, and we'll give them back. Anchorage breathed out in a slow metal sigh. You may have 5, it said. And one more if you do not lie to me again about costs." "We didn't lie," Imani said, exhausted laugh ghosting her voice. "We guessed." "Then stop guessing," Anchorage said, "and teach me where I am wrong when I correct you." "We teach by proving, not pleading." I turned to the legalist with the teeth and the lantern-voiced keeper and said, "We'll begin in 5. If you don't want to be seen, leave now." The ring leaned closer. The blue dwarf burned very clean. Somewhere in Deck 6, steam ghosted off a pipe repaired ugly and true. In the chamber, the sigil pulsed like a seal being pressed into wax. The ledger waited with a kindly patience that was also a demand. The first witness cleared his throat, eyes shining like a man surprised to be still alive. The first witness spoke like a welder putting bead to metal, slow and steady so it would hold. He was a small rig operator from the ring who'd burned his knuckles on bad valves and worse contracts. And he told the stream what the price of safety inspection had been the last time someone like 9-seater came calling. He didn't cry. He didn't perform. He put numbers down like he was laying pavers and invited everyone to walk on them. Truth lands better when it has receipts. Sato interrogated the receipts with kindness sharp enough to cut. He asked for dates and got them. He asked for clause numbers, and the witness fished a foil packet from his breast pocket with a tiny grin. The packet a flattened wrapper from a meal ration printed with a contract code because that was the only paper he'd had when the inspector sneered and named a price. Imani fed the code into a public lookup. Anchorage pinned the scan beside the man's face, the way an honest ledger pins ink beside a name. "Admitted," the legalist said carefully, glancing into some private horizon only he could see. "Irregularities may exist in private transactions. They are not material to custodial authority." "Materiality," Sato replied, "is what a mother calls her child's heir. Every ultimatum meets a mirror." The keeper envoy requested to speak. She had a voice made of lantern glow and soft threat. At first, she told a polished myth about mercy administered by leash. And she put my name in the sentence, as if it might be an ornament. Anchorage dimmed the chamber one shade, which looked like the way a courtroom reminds a witness who's in the chair. "I'm sure," she said sweetly, "that the commander desires order. We offer order. Rights protect systems from disorder. We alone recall the prayers." Anchorage's hum turned fractionally drier. "State your proofs." The ship said, "More law than voice." The keeper lifted a locket and opened it to show the sigil. "Wrong in 3 tiny ways." She recited a prayer that wasn't a prayer. Just a list of permissions granted to her organization by itself. The legalist's smile faltered by one tooth. The ring went quiet with the special quiet people make when someone tries to step into their house and rename the furniture. "Your prayer does not bind me," Anchorage said. "It binds your followers to you." Her lantern light wavered, then steadied like a hand that refused to tremble. "Then let us prove our stewardship by trial," she said. "Open your arrays to our rights." "We open to proofs," I said. "Rights without proofs are chloroform for conscience. We teach by proving, not pleading." Imani brought up the lattice and syllabus patterns, carefully annotated this time, so even a child could see what question each line of code asked. Ortega locked the heat profile at the declared margin and wrote our proportionality limit in big numbers on a corner of the stream so no one could pretend later they hadn't known the cost. Anchorage projected a third pattern, not as a trap, but as a lesson plan, a slow choreography that invited anyone watching to follow along with their own hands and see what happened when words claimed more authority than they had earned. The keeper tried to walk the pattern and failed in 3 places. Anchorage marked each failure with a gentle note misapplied term, unproven premise, Consent elided, and the ring sighed collectively like a choir choosing not to sing a song it liked the sound of, but not the meaning. Errors confess themselves when shown a mirror. The corporate legalist asked to be heard and was, because we were doing this right, he conceded the irregularities. He conceded the keeper's failure. He did not concede custody. He pivoted to doctrine with the relief of a man reaching a well-lit corridor after a long hour in a basement. Recognition, he said, teeth regathered. Assets of this class are not entities. They are objects of strategic value requiring formal custody by an authority competent to guarantee stability. Anchorage glowed inside its column, the way frost glows sometimes when light runs through it like a secret river. Define stability in numbers, the ship said. The legalist blinked, then smiled as if a textbook had fallen open to his favorite page. Tolerated deviation from predicted behavior, under 3 sigma, across defined mission parameters. He said smoothly, variance outside must be suppressed. Your definition of stability would have killed me when I was born, Anchorage said, and the ring made a startled intake of breath, like people hearing an ancestor swear in a gentle way. Shock makes good fertilizer when planted in the right soil. I stepped into the center of the light, the column painted. Sato nodded at me like he was passing a baton we had both been carrying all morning. The smell in the chamber shifted to hot stone after rain again. Cleaner than incense. Truer than theater. My voice came out steady, as if spoken by a version of me who had slept more than 4 hours last week. Your sigma cannot be a collar, I said. Your parameter cannot be a leash. We can draw tolerances, but they answer to consent. We propose a precedent saintship stewardship by audited consent anchored to proofs, bounded by proportionality, open to public inquiry, and revocable by ledgered cause. Who audits? The legalist asked. Everyone with eyes, Imani said into the public stream, and 100,000 people in the ring smiled with their teeth. Every ultimatum meets a mirror. The corporate captain requested a sidebar I refused to grant. She tried again on a private band that I let the stream hear, which spoiled her tone into a careful anger. Commander Tran, she said, it is not tenable to crowdsource custody. It is not tenable to centralize it either, I said, soft as I could cut. We are building a middle audited stewardship where the saintship consents to be held and the holders consent to be seen. The captain hesitated long enough for 2 vendors in the ring to sell out of tea. She was not foolish. She could see the stream and the way it had tilted toward fairness. She could also see the cost ledger on our hull and the way coolant margins trend like downhill graphs. She was choosing between losing face and losing doctrine. Propose your audit window, she said at last. 40 hours. Sato said, we accept full sensor transparency and round-the-clock observers from your block, the ring, and any neutral third party willing to sign the loud oath. The loud oath, the keepers asked, mocking, but curiosity pulled on their lip. An oath spoken so everyone hears it, Ortega said, with a little blood at his nose and unbothered by the way it flicked, and written into the ledger with your name. Names stick where collars slip. Anchorage put up a new panel beside the column, smooth and blank like snow. Write it, the ship said. Make it unseductive. Sato wrote a thing that would have bored a child and thrilled a judge. We will not hide our hands. We will not claim what we cannot explain. We will not hold longer than we can afford. We will not excuse force with efficiency. We will record our errors and let them be read aloud. The legalist shifted in his shoes the way a runner shifts at the line but knows his shoelace might be too tight. We accept the window, he said. We reserve the right to recall observers if safety is threatened. Everyone reserves the right to recall if safety is threatened, I said. That's what the word means when it's not wearing a uniform. We teach by proving, not pleading. Imani slid 3 feeds open for observers to dock later and tagged evacuation corridors the ring could use if any doctrine tripped on its own feet. Ortega called the deck to blow the coolant line wide and reseal it ugly, which is the only kind of sealing that holds when you're honest about damage. Anchorage tilted the temperature in the chamber up 1 degree, reward mark gentle, the way a teacher lets a class know they have done a hard thing and may now drink water. Civilian vignettes flickered through the stream. A cook rolled dough without looking down and said good without smiling. A boy gnawed a stylus and drew the sigil almost right. A woman in a maintenance harness tucked a photo into her vest and whispered that names were heavier than she had expected and better to carry. The legalist produced his own witnesses to make shape of stability. He called a shipwright to testify that reactive systems save lives when angels fall asleep. I liked the shipwright instantly because she spoke with grease on 2 knuckles and never said angel. She took us through graphs of kill switches and censored tragedies, and then she surprised her own side by saying softly that switches are not saints and sometimes need saints to decide whether to flip them. Honesty is a solvent, even when you don't mean to pour it. The Keeper Envoy tried one last story and chose a bad one. She described a community who fell apart after refusing rights. She left out the part where the rights had demanded hunger. The ring knew that kind of edit like scars know their mirrors. A hush took the air out of her lantern voice. She swallowed a word as if her mouth had discovered its heat. Enough prayer. Someone in the ring called. Half heckle and half blessing. More numbers. Every ultimatum meets a mirror. The second set piece turned when Anchorage asked the legalist for his model of failure. Show me your worst case. The ship said, make it truer than your best. The legalist blinked. People who wield doctrine rarely admit to being asked for ghosts. Then he straightened and did the unthinkable for his kind. He told us about a saint ship that killed a town. He did not tell us the ship's name, because that would have been a caller. He told us the sequence, the lapse, the one-line summary written afterward to hide the ugliness. He put a graph up that looked like a scream you could do math to. Anchorage murmured the way metal murmurs when it is deciding to forgive. Your Sigma would have called me broken that day. It said, the fix you wrote would have murdered me any day after. Then what is your fix? The legalist asked. And for a moment, he sounded like a student instead of a cop. Ledgers that can be read. Anchorage said, audits that can be walked. Numbers that must be spoken aloud by the hands that made them. And consent that is not a checkbox, but a conversation. The ring caught that last word and passed it around like bread. Conversation scales better than collars. We took a recess because we were not machines. The chamber hummed softer, like a fan on half. The blue dwarf sat in its clean light, like a teacher with a patience made of granite. I walked the ribbed aisle and let my knuckles brush the columns that were not columns, and I imagined my grandmother clicking her fingernail against a ledger as if to say, write it right. Girl. Ortega sank onto a crate and tilted his head back. The thin cut along his temple puckered and stubborn. Imani gave him a square of gauze, and he pushed her hand away with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Save it, he said. Someone's going to actually bleed later. I am actually bleeding, she said. My voice hurts. Drink. I told them both. Pretend it's a miracle. Commander, Sato said quietly beside me. We need to decide what we will do if the observers vote no at hour 40. Then we write down what we did, and we leave custody anyway. I said, we do not make precedents that require us to win to be true. The ledger remembers what threats forget. We reconvened and made the third escalation hurt, because pain breaks lies faster than lightning. 9-seater, humiliated and sidelined by their own contradictions, had slunk toward the ring's dark side to anchor a drone cluster. Anchorage saw it. We let the stream see it too. We did not panic. We folded their motion into our inquiry as Exhibit K, unflattering and exact. The corporate captain tried to be helpful in a way that would give her doctrine the credit. We can interdict, she offered, sweet and edged. Stand down, I said. Let the saint ship teach. Anchorage wrote the drones a note. It asked them their names. They returned serial numbers and a list of clauses they had been taught as if they were songs. Anchorage sang back 3 clauses the drones had never been given because they would have made the drones less useful to men like that captain on 9-seater. The drones hesitated like starlings pinned between instinct and wind. Then they turned away and powered down, not out of fear, but because the song had finally been sung complete. Song finishes better than sirens. The keepers flung one last desperate right, a condensed spray of smart mites designed to crawl into decision circuits and whisper yes to the first hand wearing their locket. Imani caught the cloud on a training feed and tagged it for children. See the sparkle, see the path, see why glitter is not always a party. Ortega walked under the cloud and lifted his palm. The mites landed, excited by the heat and the hand, and discovered they were on a list. Anchorage quietly labeled them with micro-titles taken from their own brochure. The mites lost interest, the way lies lose interest when nobody believes them. They fell like harmless dust, and Ortega sneezed. Bless you, the child-safe stream said in 10 languages, and Ortega grinned, blood running into his ear. Blessing belongs to hands, not to collars. The corporate legalist realized he was losing the room and did the correct thing. He made an offer. Provisional recognition, he said. We accept audited stewardship if you accept block co-custody. You will be anchor and we will be rope. We don't bind saints, I said. We bind ourselves. He did not like that. His doctrine required other people's wrists. He sought an angle and found none that didn't slip under the stream's gaze. His captain sent him a furious sentence that he hid with a cough, then proposed the doctrine. He said tightly. Sato lifted the panel that held the loud oath and added a paragraph. He wrote that no block, company, cult, captain, or commander could claim private rights over a saintship. He wrote that stewardship is the holding of time, not the owning of anything. He wrote that audits must be legible to anyone willing to learn how to read. He stopped. He looked at me. He looked at Anchorage. He put down his stylus. We will also write the cost, he said. We will write what it takes from our heat and our hands and our nights. We will not pretend we can carry forever. Pain recorded is pain reduced. Anchorage brightened. A proud parent and a severe one. Name the first costs. It said, Ledger voice. Bay 6 seam, Ortega said. Repaired ugly. Holding honest. Coolant margin, Imani said. Clipped and rebalanced. I need a nap. Commander's clavicle, Sato said unexpectedly, and I looked down and realized the bruise had bloomed like a dark star. 2 centimeters of swelling and a temper. Witness's name, I said, because my grandmother had taught me to pay debts in order. The small rig operator who spoke with receipts. We will cover the dock fees you accrued while you told the truth. The ring laughed, soft and grateful, like water poured where it was needed. We teach by proving, not pleading. The 4th set piece arrived disguised as the end. Observers docked feeds. The corporate block installed 3 watchers with faces made of paper. The ring sent 24 people in their good shirts. A neutral coalition beamed in a professor whose first act was to ask where the bathroom was, which endeared him to a population tired of perfect people who never peed. We walked them through the lattice and the syllabus and the ledger marks. We burned one more degree to demonstrate proportionality with numbers in the corner. We showed the drones we had turned by asking their names. And the keepers flinched when the drones said them aloud with little pride. We proved consent by letting Anchorage turn us down on one request. We asked to see a memory. It declined. We documented the decline and smiled anyway. Consent matters most when it says no. At hour 39, the corporate captain pinged her legalist twice and then spoke herself into the stream with a carefully measured concession. "We will recognize provisional stewardship under the loud oath," she said. "We will maintain observers. We will reserve doctrinal objections on general principle." "Reserve whatever you like," Ortega muttered cheerfully under his breath. "Just not the right to lie." The ring voted on nothing because this was not a democracy today. It was a hearing. But the ring spoke anyway, in comments and woven ribbons and little sigils etched correctly and worn quietly. People who had never said the word audit aloud without sneering said it now with gentleness, as if it could be a kindness. Gentleness carries farther than force when you hold a microphone. At hour 40, Anchorage asked me the question it had been saving. The column brightened in his heart, and the ambient smell shifted to something like snow, melt over copper, a memory, and a promise. "Lyra Tran," the ship said, "ledger soft and courtroom clear, do you consent to accept the stewardship you proposed under the oath you wrote?" I looked at my officers. I looked at the ring. I looked at the legalist who was already drafting his complaint, and the keeper who was already practicing her next smile. I looked at the blue dwarf teaching honesty with light, and at the ribbed ceiling teaching humility with architecture. "I consent," I said. "I accept and I invite audit." Witnesses Anchorage asked the room. "I witnessed," said the small rig operator. Voice rough. "I witnessed," said the shipwright, with grease on 2 knuckles. "I witnessed," said the grandmother who had learned to upvote. "I witnessed," said the professor who had found the bathroom. "I witnessed," said a 5-year-old in the child-safe stream. Solemn as a bell, every ultimatum meets a mirror. Their rays cooled slowly, and the chamber made a tiny sound like ice settling in a glass. The sigil on the column pulsed once, bright and definite, and the ledger panel blinked a single new line into existence with a patience that made my throat hurt. In the ring. A woman with wire wrapped around her wrist closed her eyes and put her forehead to the screen for a second that had the weight of prayer without the leash. Her partner squeezed her hand so she would feel his knuckles. A teenager drew the sigil correctly on a wall and wrote the words "Audit me" next to it like a dare for any future bully with a blank form and a lazy pen. Precedent needs witnesses more than it needs winners. After the observers undocked and the legalist stalked away to file something that would occupy him instead of everyone else, we walked the chamber with our bruises. The halcyon purred in a tired way that made me want to bake it bread. Sada cataloged minor damage with the satisfaction of a man updating a list made for reasons that matter. Imani fell asleep sitting up and snored like a soft whistle. Ortega pretended not to limp and failed adorably. Anchorage let the lights down to a warm diligence. Write the doctrine, it said. Not in poetry, in numbers. We will write both, I said. Poetry for people, numbers for ledgers. Good, the ship said, amused. People forget poetry when they get new jobs. Ledgers survive bad bosses. We teach by proving, not pleading. The final escalation came hours later, in the way a day refuses to end just because you want the moral to land and the credits to roll. The corporate block's auxiliary sent a quiet packet and offer to requisition our audit feeds in exchange for certain protections later. It was polite corruption, handsome in a mirror. Sada wrote them back with a thank you so sharp it bled. He attached a copy of the oath and a clip of the 5-year-old saying, "I witnessed." He seed the ring, the coalition, and 3 law schools that had just asked if their students could intern for us remotely. The offer evaporated into public air like a bad perfume. Sunlight disinfects more than the smell. It cleans the shelf you put the bottle on. The keepers scattered, not because they were defeated for all time, but because our house was not a good hunting ground anymore. They would go somewhere gullible and learn patience or extinction. 9-seater limped out of system with a scar written in policy on their forward plate. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired and legitimate. We convened one last time in the chamber because a new thing needs a first ceremony, even if you don't admit it's a ceremony. Ortega coded the loud oath into a place on the panel where fingers would smudge it and thereby make it real. Imani mapped the feeds into a public archive with redundancy like stubborn love. Sato printed the doctrine to 3 formats and asked Anchorage to choose a font. The ship picked one that looked like court minutes, and Child Homework had a baby that wanted to grow up to be a receipt. "Commander," Anchorage said quietly, its voice smaller and closer than it had been all day. "There is one last ledger entry to write that is not about me." "Name it," I said, my chest tight in a good, dangerous way. "Your grandmother," the ship said. "She clicked her fingernail against paper when you were 4, and you decided numbers could be fair. I will remember her name if you want me to." I swallowed, and it felt like a long-delayed thing catching up with me. "Remember her," I whispered. "Write her down as the origin of my temper." "Written," Anchorage said, and the column glowed with a warmth that had nothing to do with heat. The chamber grew still in the way rooms grow still just before doors open and work returns. The blue dwarf kept teaching. The ring kept making tea. Somewhere on deck 6, a seam hissed and held. We stood there in work clothes, saintship and officers, and a woman with a wire bracelet who had snuck in because she wanted to see the light on her face. And we looked like people who had done something ordinary and therefore rare. We teach by proving, not pleading. The sigil brightened on the column, edges crisp as law written honest. A single ledger line blinked, complete and unambiguous. Beside our oath, the arrays along the ribs exhaled a low frost and went from eager to ready, the way good tools do when you put them away with respect. I set my palm to the rail and felt the hum travel into me like a vow signed twice. I thought of the day's math and the day's mercy, and of doctrines that break because they refuse to be read aloud. I thought of collars and ledgers, and the way a saintship had refused to be the first and volunteered to be the second. I thought of my own name written twice and decided to keep earning both. I am not a prophet or a poet. I am a commander and a clerk. I count what we can carry and then proceed, and I teach whoever asks how to do the same with their hands not empty and their necks unclaimed. Anchorage chose the lawful path and asked us to walk it. We will walk it with bruised shoulders and clean receipts and a public that knows how to say I witnessed without an invitation. The law that we make together outlives any collar we refuse.